Hey, so today I'll be talking about the current state of Mono Anemo and how it doesn't really quite function right, and how it can be further improved. It is a super fun theme that I really want to make work, but it does present quite the challenge to pull off. But before I start discussing this, there's something I want to say first. You enjoying these videos are enough for me, so just thank you so much for your support. Okay, now, like always before I continue, I must put in a disclaimer. I just want to say that this is me analyzing a character's kit in terms of their utility, function, and purpose in the state of this game. I'm not saying that anyone is better because they play these characters, nor am I saying that anyone is worse because they don't. This is me objectively looking at the facts, drawing a conclusion, and presenting you all as is, like Sherlock Holmes, Scooby-Doo, or Blue's Clues, whichever one you prefer. At the end of the day, on whatever hemisphere of the Earth that you are on, you can play whoever you want, however you want, and that is completely fine. The point of a game is meant to give you enjoyment, and as there is little joy in the world, I can only hope that you at least enjoy Genshin the way you like. Now, back in 3.3, we had Wanderer release, a long-awaited character for many, along with his dedicated support, Faruzan. Wanderer was another Anemo hypercarry, with the first being Xiao, and it seemed like that Anemo was finally going to get the same DPS treatment that Xiao did. It seemed like a Mono Anemo team was finally going to be possible. And so, as we all know, Mono Anemo is a single elemental team, with either all or 3 out of 4 of the party stops being the same element, and the last spot is a flex unit. There have been some elements that can pull this archetype of teams off, the best example obviously being Xiao. Looking at how it's so involved with its own element, it even failed the artifact support set intended for Xiao's support units. I talked about this in a previous video of mine, linked down below. But Xiao seemingly tried to give Anemo the same treatment and give it some increased damage, especially with the new artifact set, Desert Pavilion Chronicle, also known as DPC, being released alongside Wanderer. Swirl was a great support reaction, but there was no reaction Anemo could trigger that could crit. This meant that when Wanderer and Faruzan dropped, this was the time. Faruzan was an Anemo support that boosted Anemo damage while simultaneously shredding Anemo resistance of enemies. She could even boost up a little bit more based on a percentage of her own base attack. Anemo main DPSs such as Xiao and Wanderer benefited greatly from the damage increase and could even afford to throw in a third Anemo unit to have an easier time generating energy. However, there were 3 massive issues that presented themselves within this new playstyle. The first was how Anemo essentially had no focus. But before we get to that, I do want to bring up the other Mono Elemental team, specifically the one that works really well, and that's Xiao. And what I want to focus on more clearly is how Mono Xiao is able to work. This team is able to function through the streamlining of one stat, defense. The supports, the sub-DPSs, and the main DPSs all focus on building defense as their main source of damage, albeit with the exception of Zhongli, and I guess Ningguang as well. It incentivizes building a specific stat for high return, especially when you are pretty much trading it all in for no reactions. And getting back to the no focus, with Mono Anemo, there is no such stat. There's only attack to prioritize, outside of the crit stats of course. There is no additional stat to build to increase Mono Anemo's damage to help it keep up with the other teams out there. With Xiao, defense can work for all types of units regardless of whether they're supposed to do damage or be support. The only other stat that Anemo could possibly use is EM, but that only works for supports, not DPSs. And if that isn't bad enough to begin with, Mono Anemo, the whole point of the team, is to not swirl elements, and the only time that could happen is if the 4th unit, which is the flex unit, was either Pyro, Hydro, Electro, or Cryo, and even that isn't meant to be the point of Mono Anemo. Again, with the only stat to go for being attacked, you might as well throw in some other non-Anemo units for reactions so there'll be more damage. The next issue that presented itself was Faruzan herself. Faruzan's role made sense in her being a support that could boost Anemo in a myriad of ways, but what was really annoying was that she had really bad energy issues. Her elemental skill had a pretty low cooldown, but produced very little particles, and she's very energy hungry. And with her burst being a hefty 80 burst cost, this just didn't cut it. Most of the time she would be placed in a team where another Anemo unit, aka the main DPS, Zhongli and Bennett, in a hypercarry style sort of team that could pretty much maximize damage. Despite most units being able to get by in energy when there's another unit with the same element on the team, Faruzan still struggles with energy. Her energy recharge needs can go up to about 250%, which is just absolutely ridiculous. And while there is somewhat of a solution with the Emblem of Severed Fate artifact set, the energy void is still quite prominent despite that. The constellations don't really allow her to generate much energy either, unless you have her at C6. Her first constellation allows her to fire one extra hurricane arrow every time she activates her skill. However, this does absolutely nothing for energy, as only the first arrow that is shot out can produce particles. C2 just increases the duration of her burst by a bit, which again doesn't help out with any energy. C4 is better because it does allow her to generate energy whenever the pressurized collapses from her hurricane arrows hit opponents for a max of 4 energy per collapse. And her C6 allows her burst to deal extra crit damage through Anemo damage of other characters by 40%, while also allowing a pressurized collapse to occur whenever the active character deals damage when they are affected by the buff of her burst. This is extra sort of pressurized collapse damage. Essentially, it has a cooldown of 3 seconds and is shared by all party members. Her C4 and C6 are able to then work in tandem, being able to generate more energy for Faruzan and greatly minimize her energy needs. However, getting C6 Faruzan just to make your Anemo DPS work is just a goddamn hassle. It's just too much. She should be able to function well at C0, so doing this is just unbelievably annoying. Not to mention her Geo counterpart, Goro, can produce a bit more particles and has other teammates that can produce particles for him, such as Albedo with him doing off-field damage and providing energy particles with his Solar Satoma. And speaking of Albedo, that actually brings me to the last part of this complex problem. The bigger reason why Mono Anemo is incomplete is that there is no dedicated sub-DPS for it. For Geo, Albedo satisfies us quite well, being able to place down a skill and perform as an optimal sub-DPS, dealing decent off-field damage and producing pretty consistent particles for his team. However, with Anemo, we don't have any of that yet. Maybe we will in the future, but as of right now, none of that exists. Sucrose, Kazuo, and Venti can all have their burst deal some off-field damage, but each one of them has their own problems with that. With energy, you need to build enough energy for her to get out her burst, and that just takes too much time, not to mention it doesn't last long enough. Kazuo's burst is easier to get out, but just like Sucrose, it lacks the ease of being able to place down and last long enough. And Venti has a set distance of aiming with his burst. Not to mention, all of these three aforementioned characters have higher rewards when you build them for support builds that they are intended for. Moving on to healers, Sayu is somewhat meant to be a healing driver that can work in tandem with other units like Xiangling, Kaya, Kuki Shinobu, etc. And if not, you can just throw down her Muji Muji Daruma for some off-field healing. And the same goes for Jean. Her utility is mainly used for an initial massive wave of overall healing and then some off-field healing to boot. The only other role she has is to be used in the Sunfire technique, where she is swirling the power applied to the active character from Bennett's burst. And the rest, specifically Wanderer, Xiao, and Hazo, are all main DPSs. I mean, no wonder it's a bit of a struggle to make Mono Anemo work when we lack a Anemo sub DPS. Having an Anemo sub DPS is not only help with outputting more damage, but would actually solve Faruzan's energy issues, allowing her to easily get her burst so that she can consistently buff the on-fielder. The only thing that would be an issue is that Mono Anemo doesn't have another stat to prioritize. This all falls in the hands of Hoyo and whether we will get an Anemo unit that could fulfill this niche. But since we're here, why don't I just come up with a solution myself? It's going to be a while, but I hope you enjoyed some kit building. So here they are, the dedicated Anemo sub DPS that I wish we had. For their weapon type, I think I'll choose a Claymore for them to wield. I don't really know why, I just wanted to have another Anemo Claymore unit. As for what type of damage I want them to have, I think of a specific artifact set in mind that I need to have. And for that, I'm going to go with Tenacity of the Millith. With its 2-piece boosting effect on HP, and its 4-piece effect boosting attack and shield strength of everyone in the party, this unit should be dealing damage based on HP. Yes, I know. It's getting exhausting that everyone these days is dealing damage based on HP, or some other stat, but I wanted to give this unit a complete kit that won't flop. Additionally, this way Faruzan can be built on a different set like Noblesse or Emblem of Severed Fate, as there is a more niche build in which she's C6 and can use the 4-piece Tenacity of the Millith set, so there's not going to be an overlap by making sure that this sub-DPS can use Tenacity, since Tenacity cannot have its 4-piece effect stack. I'll also style the way they deal damage sort of like Albedo, since he is what I'm trying to mirror and recreate in this team. As for rarity, that doesn't really seem to matter at all, since this character isn't probably ever going to be real, but I would want them to be a 4-star. That way this character could be more accessible to the masses, and no exorbitant amount of primos would have to be used in order to obtain them. Well, either that, or you better hope you don't get the 5-star on the banner before you get the 4-star. For the theming of this character, I think I will choose a griffin. If you don't know what a griffin is, it is a mythological creature that has the body of a lion and the wings of an eagle. Sometimes the head is either a lion or an eagle, but usually the body and the wings are pretty consistent. By using this as a foundation, I'll be able to make the kit of the character fitting to the Anemo element. Oh, and their constellation will be called Gryphon, which is Latin for griffin. Their normal charge and plunging attack won't be anything crazy or special, just pretty standard. As for the elemental skill named Lionic Roar, they will throw down a field with a radius of 5, again, just like Albedo. When using the skill, it will place down a griffin feather at the center of the field. You can also opt to hold the skill in order to better place down the griffin feather. The griffin feather does initial AoE Anemo damage based on the character's max HP when placed. This field will constantly generate a flying vortex that will suck in enemies when they enter, pulling them closer to the griffin feather. It will look like a larger, sort of greenish version of the vacuum field from the Viridescent Hunt Bow from the Battle Pass. This flying vortex has the same pull as Kazuo's tap skill, and can slowly pull in bigger enemies that are more resistant to crowd control. The flying vortex will deal AoE Anemo damage to opponents in the field every 1.5 seconds. This damage is based on a percentage of the character's max HP, and the field has a duration of 18 seconds, while the cooldown of the skill activation is 6. Doing the math, this is 12 times the flying vortex can deal damage before its cooldown is up. This is frequent enough to proc the tenacity of the mill of 4-piece effect, giving efficient and consistent attack boosting when necessary. For energy generation, the skill will not generate particles when cast, but will produce one animal particle for every opponent hit by the field's flying vortex every 1.5 seconds. This works quite well for AoE situations where there are a bit more enemies. As for the elemental burst Piercing Howl, this character will have a 60 burst cost that, when activated, will aim at the closest enemy and release a vertical stream of breeze rings that will deal AoE Anemo damage based on a percentage of their max HP. This attack hits 10 times, essentially 10 breeze rings, and can pass through enemies to hit targets behind the first. This is a linear attack, sort of like Kaya's elemental skill. These attacks have a pretty low damage multiplier, so that, when added up, it's about the average amount of damage an elemental burst would have. And as for the passives, I will make their first passive, named Strike from the Skies, increase the damage of breeze rings by 5% for every opponent hit by the flying vortex of Lionic Roar. Different instances of damage from flying vortex on the same opponents will not count towards its damage increase. The max damage increase that can be obtained this way is 60%, so essentially if you hit a different enemy every damage instance of flying vortex. This will give a nice increase to the burst damage, pretty much making it a bit more worthwhile to actually use. I know that there's this thing with Albedo where his burst isn't really all that worth it to use, which is totally understandable, but I do want to make this Anemo, fan-made Anemo sub-DPS a bit more viable in terms of their burst damage. And as for their second passive, named Curving Gale, whenever a flying vortex defeats an opponent, it will generate 2 energy for nearby party members other than this character. This energy generation can only happen once every flying vortex damage interval and will only count for the first opponent defeated per proc. This passive will massively alleviate energy issues for Faruzan, Wanderer, and Xiao, allowing them to not have to worry about energy recharge. Having this being the second passive also means that you will not gain the comfort of this passive unless you actually put in enough time and investment into this character to access it. As for the characters, C1 will give the flying vortex a stronger pull, allowing for more resistant enemies to be dragged into the hot mess. C2 will allow the field generated from Griffin Feather to last 24 seconds instead of 18, allowing for the flying vortex to hit for a total of an additional 4 times, so essentially 16 damage intervals. This constellation can give more comfort in longer rotations of 20 seconds. C3 will increase the level of their elemental skill by 3, giving more damage. C4 will give a little bit of extra damage. Whenever Flying Vortex performs a crit hit, a smaller hit of AoE Anemo damage will hit enemies with a Feather Blast, dealing 15% of character's max HP as Anemo damage. Now, this will be considered as their elemental skill, so it can help proc Tenacity a lot better. C5 increases the level of their burst by 3, and C6 would increase the damage of the Flying Vortex from Lionic Roar by 20% of the character's attack. This will essentially give them a bit of a damage increase, essentially allowing any attack stat they have to not go to waste. As for weapons, Dea's signature weapon, Beacon of the Reed Sea, could work, as the crit rate substat can increase chances of higher damage, and when this character's C4 procs, passive can increase HP by a hefty amount when not using a shield. Sky would probably be a great all-around weapon for this unit, as it would give some ER while also increasing all damage by a small percent. Getting to 4-star weapons, Blackcliff Slasher isn't a bad stat stick for the crit damage subset that it gives, although its attack passive won't be useful until C6. Vivoni's Greatsword is great for giving white particles to everyone in the party, so just make sure to build enough crit on this character. Inazuma's 4-star weapon, Katsura Gakiri Nagamasa, gives some energy recharge while also increasing skill damage quite decently, but it does happen to be more elemental burst oriented. The bell would finally get some usage here as well, taking that massive HP substat to increase this character's damage. And as for a 3-star option, Fair Shadow still gives a pretty decent HP substat. I know that this was quite the digression for me talking about the issues with Mono Anemo, but I really wanted to try and come up with a solution by making an actual unit, or the fan-made unit. So if you enjoyed fan building of this character, then I'm happy that you did. So yeah, looking at the situation that Mono Anemo is in, I don't believe that this team can sustain what it needs as of right now. But if there's a unit in the future that can somewhat encapsulate the made-up kit I just fabricated right now, then there might actually be a chance. That and one more person can actually use the bell. And as for me recording this, you know, Lynette has now been teased as a new Anemo character from Fontaine, so who knows? Maybe she will fulfill this role. And with that, you already know what button to press if you want to see more on a regular basis. And if you have something to say, I can only hope that it's nice. Thank you, and bye!